Yeah. Hi, I'm Pushpa Kalra. I'm the co-facilitator of this course with Ken Burns. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker. But first, I want to welcome you for the first talk in the Food and Nutrition series. We've put together an interesting series of 5 lectures in this course. It's not what you might expect at first glance, talking about the keto diet or the Mediterranean diet, but rather we are going more into food and different aspects of it. And you'll see from the titles, that the course is very varied and interesting. Our first speaker in this series is Matt Beke. Matt is from the Fixel Institute. He is actually a registered dietitian who is working towards his PhD. He's almost completed his PhD at the Food and Human Nutrition Department on campus. But he's working also at the Fixel Institute next door to us with patients with Parkinson's, counseling them and meeting with them on their diets. His research work is devoted to exploring how dietary fiber influences motility in people with Parkinson's disease and with constipation. He's studying the impact of nutrition on neurological diseases. So last, about 6 months ago, we had done a series on the microbiome. And at that time, one of the experts on Parkinson's had given us a talk on the microbiome and its effect on Parkinson's, how it influences the brain function. So I don't know exactly what Matt is going to talk about, but he will be discussing the microbiome too, and how the microbiome is influenced by the diet, right? So we go one step back in that, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Matt, for doing this.
Switch over here. Oh, yes. Okay, let's do that. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, my name is Matthew Beke. I'm a registered dietitian. I mostly work with people who have Parkinson's disease, but I also counsel folks at the Fixel Institute that have other neurological conditions as well as their families. So MS, ALS, Alzheimer's, dementia, MSA, things like that. I'm very happy to be here to share with you some information on the gut-brain axis, how diet affects the bacteria that live in our guts, and how that affects neurological health. Okay. Okay, so we have some objectives here on the screen. I'm just going to roll through these, but basically, again, like I said, we're going to talk about the guts, relation to food, and relation to neurological health. There we go. Okay, so a little bit of background on Parkinson's disease to start the talk, to give us some perspective here. So Parkinson's disease, unfortunately, a fairly common neurological condition. About 60,000 people per year are diagnosed with PD. And there's 1 million people living with PD in America and about 10 million cases worldwide. Unfortunately, these numbers are rising year over year. But Parkinson's is characterized by specific motor symptoms. So I'm sure many of you, when you think of Parkinson's, maybe you know someone with Parkinson's disease, you think about their motor symptoms, the shaking tremor, the slowness of their movements, maybe some rigidity in their limbs, and they might also have gait and balance issues as well. And this comes from the death of certain neurons in the brain. There's an accumulation of a misfolded protein called alpha-synuclein. And we'll talk a little bit about how these guys get into the brain, or how it's hypothesized they get there. But these misfolded proteins accumulate and destroy the nerves in that motor control center of the brain, the substantia nigra pars compacta. And so once that starts, immediately you don't necessarily get motor symptoms, but at about 60 to 70% of loss of those motor neurons, that's when you start seeing those motor symptoms in these patients. And so these neurons, they produce dopamine to help our muscles move. And so the way that we treat that is to give that dopamine in the form of medication. Typically, it's given as Sinemet, it's the common name of it, but it's two medicines in one. It's called carbidopa-levodopa, and one of them is kind of an inhibitor for the dopamine that's in the medication to make sure that most of it, or as much as possible, can get to the brain. And you can see here, if I use my laser pointer, you can see here in a normal neuron, you see all of these dopamine molecules. They're going to their proper receptor, and then they initialize normal movement. But in the Parkinson's disease, there's really very, very little of that dopamine, and so movement is unable to occur normally. Now, there's also non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease, and one of the big ones that we'll be talking about today is constipation. But there's also things like gastroparesis, which is slowness of the stomach, so the stomach doesn't empty into the small bowel as quickly as it should. Dysphagia, meaning trouble swallowing, that is very oftentimes something experienced by people with Parkinson's. Anosmia, which is the lack of the ability to smell. Dysgeusia, the change in the ability to taste. And then there's also more psychological things that can occur too: apathy, depression, and anxiety. And you can kind of probably guess or realize that a lot of the things on the screen here, they can affect your nutrition. And so again, these all kind of play a role together. And so again, we're going to talk a little bit about how nutrition and dietetics and medical nutrition therapy can affect neurological health. So again, constipation is kind of my specialty, if you will, bowel function. So I'm going to give you a little background on it because I think it's a nice kind of context or foundation for the discussion today. So as I mentioned, constipation, very common. It's actually one of the most common non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And oftentimes it's experienced decades before that motor stage of the disease. So nowadays, physicians are kind of recommending, hey, if you're somebody in your 30s, 40s, and 50s and you suffer from constipation chronically, you might want to go see a neurologist because, again, constipation, again, is one of those symptoms that could indicate Parkinson's. Obviously, being constipated is not fun, and so there's a huge hit to people's quality of life when you are chronically constipated. And oftentimes, it's semi-hard to treat, but we try with laxatives and stimulants and stool softeners, but there's always this oscillation. Very often, people experience this constipation oscillating with diarrhea, and that makes just living your life very hard. You're kind of scared to go out. You can't do the things that you might want to do. And so nutritionally, I, as a dietitian, try to not necessarily move people away from those products, but I'd like to try to solve the problem with food because I can nourish them at the same time as improve or completely resolve those GI symptoms. On the right here, you can kind of see a breakdown of how frequently people with Parkinson's experience a lot of these different non-motor symptoms. And so you can see here, basically the dots that are farther away from the center indicate higher frequency. So you can see constipation, the highest frequency non-motor symptom here. Some other ones here, excessive straining during defecation, which is another metric for constipation. And some of the other ones here, speech disturbance, early satiety, other things there. So interesting to look at. Now, I want to start talking about the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease, specifically related to the gastrointestinal tract. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you might develop or someone might develop Parkinson's disease. You might be predisposed genetically to developing the disease. You could be exposed to something in the environment. There's a lot of agrochemicals that could be neurotoxic. But one of the more recent and most interesting hypotheses that has been shared about Parkinson's disease is how it might start in the gastrointestinal tract. So to summarize this slide and the next, you have different layers in your gastrointestinal tract. And I'm going to walk you through this little slide or this little picture here in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And so if you can imagine, your gastrointestinal tract, specifically your small and large intestines, is structured as you see here. There's this layer of projections that the food material that you eat kind of rubs up against. These are your villi. And so these have tiny, small projection, finger-like projections on them, and they help us break down and absorb food. But under that, you can see kind of a alternating layer of muscle and then a nerve netting, if you will. So you have a layer of muscle underneath the villi, you have this nerve netting, and then a couple more layers of muscle, and then another layer of nerve netting. And this is integrated into the nervous system. So the nervous system kind of plugs into the gastrointestinal tract. These nerve nets are kind of its own part of the nervous system, and this controls the gastrointestinal tract. Before I move on to the next slide, I just quickly want to at least mention these pictures down here on the bottom of the screen. Basically, what they've found is that there's alpha-synuclein accumulations in the gastrointestinal tracts of people with Parkinson's disease. Interestingly, there's also alpha-synuclein accumulation in people that never develop Parkinson's disease. And so it could be a matter of location. Does the location of the accumulation really dictate whether or not someone will get Parkinson's? But again, bringing it back to how Parkinson's might sprout up in relation to gastrointestinal function. We believe that there's some type of trigger in a certain person as it relates to their gut microbiome. Again, the bacteria that lives in the gastrointestinal tract. Maybe it's something exposed to them in the environment. Maybe it's a change in diet. Could be something completely different. But there's a change, most likely, in the makeup of the bacteria in someone's gastrointestinal tract. And this irritates the immune system. The immune system is in very, very close communication with the bacteria in our gastrointestinal tracts. So close, actually, that the immune system actually reaches in between the cells of the gastrointestinal tract and grabs part of those bacteria and pulls it back through to the other side to examine it. Now, if you have a bad makeup of bacteria in the lumen of your gut and the immune system senses that, it says, oh, whoa, there's some bad hombres on the other side of this gastrointestinal wall. I should get ready for an attack, because if they break through this fairly small barrier, it's just one layer of cells essentially, we're going to have a fight on our hands. And so the immune system prepares for battle. And that inflammatory response over a long period of time can cause normal metabolic processes to go awry. Your cells in your gastrointestinal tract, they just want to do their thing. They want to make their proteins, they want to do their job. But when there's a lot of inflammation around for a long period of time, they can't. And so sometimes proteins get misfolded. And so again, as this inflammation goes on for long periods of time, maybe some proteins are misfolded. Maybe that alpha-synuclein protein I mentioned earlier, maybe that gets misfolded, and those misfolded proteins can travel up the nerves and deposit preferentially in the brain. And so this is a paper from Dr. Tansey, who I believe talked with you all a while ago, from one of her papers in 2017. You can walk through the steps here. There's some type of trigger, and then there's intestinal inflammation and permeability. There's that chronic inflammatory state. Proteins misfold, they travel up the nervous system, and then they get into the brain and deposit there preferentially. So pretty incredible, right? I mean, this is absolutely fascinating, tragic for the people with Parkinson's disease, but definitely something that we as dietitians are interested in, because guess what? The diet is the master regulator of the gut microbiome. So let's talk about that a little more. We've already kind of been talking about it a little bit, but I'll tell you a little bit more about the gut microbiota, or the bacteria that live in our gastrointestinal tract. They do a lot of things for us. At least the good ones do, the good bugs do. They help us produce essential vitamins and minerals like thiamine and vitamin K and folate. They are also the beings that break down food material that we can't through our normal digestive processes. Anything that can't be broken down by our digestive processes that are saccharides are called dietary fibers. And those dietary fibers are the main source of nutrition, if you will, for those bacteria. So you can kind of start to see maybe we need to be feeding our bugs the right stuff to make sure that our nervous system and our bodies stay healthy. And so again, they break down these dietary fibers into signaling molecules and other species of chemicals that benefits us in some way. And so these chemicals, or a large portion, a large family of these chemical compounds, are called short-chain fatty acids. And so some of these bugs make short-chain fatty acids. Some of these bacteria make different molecules and they cross-feed, they go back and forth. It's not as simple as I eat fiber, bacteria one makes short-chain fatty acids, and I use the short-chain fatty acids. There's a million billion different cross pathways of feeding there between many, many, many different bacteria for us to get that final product or whatever molecule of interest we're talking about. Now, it's important to discuss here, we as Americans, unfortunately, are awful at eating fiber. I hate to break it to you. The recommended amount of fiber for people to consume is about 14 grams per 1,000 calories. And so what that breaks down to is for the average adult, we need to be eating between 25 and 38 grams of fiber. Guys, you're on the higher end. You should be eating around 35 to 38 grams of fiber a day, most likely. Women, of course, because they eat less calories, they don't need to eat as much fiber when you break it down by fiber grams per calories. But again, most Americans are eating, again, about 14 grams of fiber a day, so well under what we need to be doing. Now, as it relates to Parkinson's, as I just said, we only consume about 14 to 18 grams of fiber. Lower fiber intake has a lot of negative side effects on gastrointestinal function, even outside of the effect that it could have on the gut microbiome. There's an increased risk for constipation, but the type of fiber matters too, which we'll talk about a little bit here. Nutrition in Parkinson's is a fairly new aspect of scientific research, and so we don't have a ton of information just yet on it, but we've been working very hard over definitely the past 10 years, not me specifically, but the community has been working very hard for at least the past 10 years to really kind of hone in on some of these things. So again, dietary fiber can improve the function of the gut microbiome and thereby our bodies by providing that source of energy for those good bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract. And so those bacteria use fermentation to actually break down those fibers. And so what you can see here is there are some substrates, so kind of the beginning products for the microbes in our guts. Some of them are dietary fibers, starches, and of course, short-chain fatty acids that are just naturally there. Some other things are bile acids and amino acids and other compounds. But we're really interested in these dietary fibers and resistant starch. The end products here, again, are short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Now, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about butyrate. Butyrate is very, very hotly researched. So hotly researched that you could very easily Google butyrate and find many, many, many different people selling butyrate supplements. So I am not one to recommend that you necessarily go buy those supplements just yet. There needs to be a lot more research done. But butyrate is still interesting, and so I want to talk about it a little bit. Butyrate is the major source of energy for the cells in your gastrointestinal tract, specifically your colon. Those are called colonocytes. It's also, unfortunately, the least abundant short-chain fatty acid produced by the gut microbiome through fermentation. This is kind of what it looks like, its chemical structure here. The butyrate-producing bacteria rely on butyrate or rely on cross-feeding, so different molecules from other bacteria. And so the communities of bugs are very important. You can't just take, say, a probiotic of bacteria that like to produce butyrate and call it a day. Because if they don't have the correct substrates to produce butyrate, they never will. And so the community, the environment of the entire gastrointestinal tract, specifically, again, the colon, needs to be something that we think about here. And of course, as we've already discussed, butyrate, as well as the other short-chain fatty acids, influence our immune system and thus our neurological health. Move this down here so we can read the title here. Yeah, how do we do that?
Up one more, where it says hide clothing, reading.
Where are we at here? Oh, there it is. Fantastic. Very good. Okay. So, have a couple of charts on the screen here. This is from a recent study back in 2022 by Dr. Chen and their group. Basically, what they showed is that fecal butyrate is lower in people with Parkinson's compared to healthy controls, and it's associated with increased motor severity scores. So I want to caution people, I don't think we need to read super duper deep into this, but it's interesting at least to see that people with PD don't have as much butyrate in their gastrointestinal tract, at least what we can detect in the stool. And so again, maybe that suggests once again, a change in the communities of bacteria in the guts of people with Parkinson's disease. Now over here on the right, of course, you can see here the MDS UPDRS is basically a tool used by movement disorder specialists as well as neurologists in general to estimate the severity of one's motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease. So higher score is worse. And so you can see here as you have worse motor symptoms, you also have lower levels of butyrate that they could detect in the stool. So again, we don't necessarily need to read too much into that, but that is interesting to see. I would definitely like to see a little bit more research on this here. Another interesting slide that I want to show you here is that consuming higher amounts of vegetable proteins and polysaccharides, so again, kind of more fiber type material, is associated with more short chain fatty acid production in the gastrointestinal tract here. So what you can see is high vegetable protein consumption, high polysaccharide consumption, and just high dietary fiber consumption in general increases short chain fatty acid concentrations in the gastrointestinal tract. So again, we're starting to see some things here. We're really starting to see that diet can significantly affect what's going on in the gastrointestinal tract. And so maybe it is indeed the diet that can maybe mitigate a lot of the problems in certain neurological conditions. So here's the summary of the diet and the gut microbiome, and we're going to take it to the neurology in the next step here. So we want to consume a diet that's rich in plant-based foods, lots of fruits, lots of veggies, lots of beans and peas and lentils, lots of grains with their fiber intact. And again, we want to hit our goal. We want to hit 25 to 38 grams of fiber a day, if possible. And what this will hopefully do for us is increase the production of those good beneficial microbes, and more specifically, their byproducts that we're interested in, kind of fosters the communities of bugs that we want. And then, of course, what we think now, what we hypothesize, and that's why we have a dotted arrow here, is that this influences our health, specifically our neurological health, which is very exciting for us as dietitians and neurological researchers. So I've included some other things here about Parkinson's, again, just kind of general stuff that I want to bring to your attention so that you have this knowledge going forward. But there's some other things in Parkinson's that we want to take into account. These are things that I talk with my patients about very often. Low blood pressure, very common problem in people with Parkinson's disease. And so what I typically recommend to them is stay well hydrated, increase their blood volume by staying hydrated, and also increase their salt intake as long as they don't have another condition that would, of course, not allow them to do that. As I mentioned at the top of the talk, there's an alteration in the way that someone tastes and smells in PD. Sometimes they completely lose all of their ability to taste and smell. And so if they still have some ability, we want to really emphasize spices and salt, again, if appropriate, as well as pepper and things like that. Something funny about this that I want to mention is that many of my patients with Parkinson's disease who tell me that they've lost all ability to taste and smell, they still sense sweetness. And so they're very, very accustomed to sweet treats, cookies, cakes, pastries, things like that, because they can still taste it. And I can't blame them, right? If that's the only thing you can taste, I don't blame you for wanting a couple cookies every day. Swallowing difficulties are also something very common in Parkinson's, unfortunately. And so what I counsel my patients on is really about modifying the texture of the food. We don't necessarily want to completely change the diet. We still want to eat the foods that we like. We still want to get the right amount of nutrition in the body, but we might need to alter that texture of the food. Maybe it's as simple as adding a gravy of some kind, maybe some other condiment to help lubricate the food, if you will. Maybe sometimes it's changing the cooking technique. Maybe we need to sous vide something to make it really, really soft and moist so it goes down nice and easy. Again, we talked about constipation here. Hydration might be helpful with that, but really it comes down to fiber. One of the things that I really encourage my patients to consume when they tell me that they have constipation is fruit. So one of the things that I want to pause here and talk about is a lot of folks like to talk about fiber in terms of solubility. They think about soluble fiber versus insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber coming from fruit, insoluble fiber coming from veggies, generally speaking. This is an oversimplification that I won't get too much into, but we don't really care about solubility. What we care about is its viscosity in the gastrointestinal tract. We want to see what its behavior is once we consume it and how it affects, quote unquote, flow in the GI tract, because that is what dictates how effectively a certain fiber works for constipation symptoms. There's some other things with Parkinson's here. Some folks, maybe 1 in 10, they have a significant interaction between protein sources and their medication. So that carbidopa-levodopa that I mentioned earlier, that's most likely because the chemical structure of certain amino acids, as well as their medications, are very similar. And so the body is, it can kind of bring in the amino acid a little easier than it can the medication. And so people who are sensitive to it take their medication, and if it's too close to a meal that has a high amount of protein in it, they get no effect of the medication at all because that medication is left in the gut. The amino acids from the meats that they ate come in first. Now, again, this is something that many people come to me and tell me they're worried about, but like I said, it's very, very uncommon. 1 in 10, if that, of my patients need to really worry about this. Weight loss, also unfortunately very common in Parkinson's disease because, of course, you can kind of think about why, right? I mean, they have motor symptoms. That takes energy. That takes calories. And so, again, it's something that we really want to keep an eye on at least, because otherwise someone can lose weight. When you're losing weight, you're not just losing fat, you're losing muscle too. And a lot of the immune system resides in the muscle. And so, again, we want to be careful with that. We want to encourage our patients to eat a good, wide variety diet, but sometimes we really do need to emphasize that calorie and that protein. So there's a lot of diets that we recommend for PD. Mind diet, ketogenic diet, gluten-free diet, lots of options out there. Does anyone have a guess for what we recommend for Parkinson's disease? Maybe one of the previous speakers already talked about it. Any guesses for what might, sorry? Keto, okay, that's one guess. Not gluten-free. Any other thoughts? Sorry? What's the mind diet? Is that the question? That's a good question. That's a very plant-based diet that's also low salt. That was a diet that was, still is popular for people who are at risk of or have Alzheimer's or dementia. But the diet, again, thinking back to the gut microbiome and the gut-brain axis, how do we encourage those good communities of bacteria to really grow and proliferate? How do we make those short-chain fatty acids that are going to positively influence our immune system and nervous system? Well, we've got to give them the food that they need, and that comes in the form of a variety of dietary fibers. And so we do recommend a Mediterranean diet, and I want to just pause here and say that the Mediterranean diet is actually the diet I recommend for 99.9% of people. This is an extremely healthy diet. Outside of Parkinson's disease, it's the diet I follow because of the literature out there is just so straightforward when it comes to cardiovascular health, gastrointestinal health across the board. So this is a very, very healthy diet for everybody. Now, it might not work for somebody's specific health goals. Maybe they have a weight loss goal. Maybe certain things don't work for them, but this type of diet can be amenable for almost any health goal. And so again, I want to bring it back to butyrate and short-chain fatty acids in the gut microbiome. And so there was a study done in 2016 showing that the Mediterranean diet and adherence to the Mediterranean diet is associated with more butyrate production and favorable microbes. And so you can see here in this graph, the higher the short-chain fatty acid production, this was the Mediterranean diet score. So a higher score is better. More Mediterranean diet score, more short-chain fatty acid production. So that's really, really good. We like to see that. But it makes sense, right? You're eating fibers that are eventually turned into those short-chain fatty acids. And so again, we're getting the benefit via the gut microbiome from our diets, not just nourishing us, but from what they do themselves, the bacteria. There was also a study in 2020, so fairly recently, showing that the Mediterranean diet alters the gut microbiome in folks who were a little older, and it reduced their frailty and improved their health status. So this is a 1-year diet intervention across 5 European countries of 600 or so people. And so again, higher Mediterranean diet adherence, more beneficial bacteria, lower frailty, improved cognition, higher short-chain fatty acid production, lower inflammation markers, I don't think I really have to sell this too hard to you here. This is looking really good. But what is it, right? What is the Mediterranean diet? I've talked a lot about it. We've said, I'm sure you've heard the Mediterranean diet talked about a lot. What actually is it? And so I want to run you through what I recommend people eat based on the scientific literature. And so again, generally speaking, the Mediterranean diet is abundant consumption of plant-based foods, a lot of fruit, a lot of veggies, a lot of whole grains, pulses, which are beans and peas and lentils, nuts and seeds, and of course, extra virgin olive oil. And so I'll run you through each of these right now to tell you how much to consume. So I'll start down here at the bottom actually with extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil, very healthy fat. It's an unsaturated fat that's very good for the cardiovascular system, in addition to the gastrointestinal system and nervous system. But it kind of has a fat that gets turned into those very, very anti-inflammatory fats, EPA and DHA. You hear about them a lot when you see advertisements for fish oil. That's the type of fat that we get from eating fish and seafood. So we recommend folks eat about 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day. Now, don't get me wrong. You don't have to get your shot glasses out and start knocking back olive oil. I know people who do that. You do not have to do that. I want to be clear. I recommend people just cook with it. Be fairly heavy-handed with it when you're cooking with it. If you're cooking something really hot, though, so above 400, 410 degrees, I would say try to, or maybe use a different oil, not olive oil, because it will burn, it will smoke. And so you might want to use something like grapeseed oil. Similar fat, almost as good, but slightly higher smoke point. And so again, you're still getting some of the benefits there, but you can cook something a little hotter. Nuts and seeds, very, very healthy. They have a little bit of protein, very healthy amounts of those unsaturated fats, just like with olive oil. And so we recommend people get a serving of nuts at least 3 times a week. All nuts are good. Walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts. Those are some of the fattier nuts. Pistachios, cashews are great too. We even lump peanuts into the nuts there, even though they're not technically a nut. But we do recommend 3 servings of nuts a week or more. You can have a serving of nuts every day if you'd like to, but keep in mind a serving of nuts is very small. It's maybe, depending on the size of your palm, maybe 1/3 of your palm. So especially if you're kind of looking at your weight and watching your weight, you don't want to gain too much weight from excessive calorie consumption. Nuts are something to keep an eye on. Very healthy, but very calorically dense. So eat them, but just watch your serving size. Pulses, again, are beans and peas and lentils. We do recommend people eat about a cup of these beans or peas or lentils at least 3 times a week. So this could be a great meatless Monday thing. It's a great side dish. It can go great on tacos. So again, try to get those in the diet often too. They're a great source of plant-based protein, a great source of energy, those complex carbohydrates, but again, also a great source of a fairly unique fiber. The fiber that's in pulses is a little different than the fibers that's in fruits and veggies and whole grains. So again, we want to feed as many different communities of bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract as possible. So we got to get a lot of variety in these fiber-containing foods. Whole grains, I don't actually have a quantity for you to consume. You don't have to eat, a slice of bread a day. What we recommend is when you eat bread or pasta or rice, that you choose the option that has higher fiber. So the whole wheat bread, whole grain bread, sprouted grain bread, 7-grain bread, whatever they're talking about, whole wheat pasta, wild rice, brown rice. We want that fiber in there. That's where a lot of the vitamins are as well. And so at least in the rice, we want that in our diet. So again, when you're eating those things, go for the higher fiber option. Veggies, very important. We have a fairly standard recommendation for quantity though, at least 2 servings of veggies a day. That's pretty easy. What I challenge my patients and you all to do is try to get 15 different veggies into your diet each week. So it's okay to eat starchy veggies. It's okay to eat corn. It's okay to eat potatoes. It's okay to eat green beans, which indeed are starchy vegetables. That's fine, but that's only 3 out of your 15. So now you got to get the carrots and the cauliflower and the broccoli and the bell peppers and the asparagus and Brussels sprouts and spinach and radicchio and butterhead lettuce and so on and so forth. So as much variety in your veggies as you possibly can. And my favorite thing on this first slide here about the Mediterranean diet is the fruit. Fruit is something that I talk about so much with my patients, mainly because of how great it is for gastrointestinal function. Again, fruit, especially berries and kiwi, contain a fiber that keeps things moving in the gastrointestinal tract. So if you're experiencing any metric of constipation, whether that's infrequency or straining or incomplete bowel movements, I would highly recommend you get a little bit more of those deep blue and red berries or kiwi in the diet, but all fruit are good. So try to get 3 cups of fruit a day. If you're not a fruit person, smoothies can be great. I love blackberries, but if you put a bowl of blackberries in front of me, I might have 1 or 2. But if you slap down a frozen berry smoothie, I'll suck down 2 cups of berries very, very quickly. So again, maybe change the modality of how you're eating the fruit to get those 3 cups a day. Now, what do we want to get in the diet, but maybe not a ton of? So what we want is moderate consumption of fatty fish, maybe some dairy products, maybe some eggs, poultry, and maybe some wine. So I want to start off with fatty fish. We do recommend fish or seafood being the main source of protein in the Mediterranean diet. So at least 3 servings a week. One of those 3 servings of fish or seafood a week should be a very fatty fish. So that's the one I have listed here: tuna, mackerel, salmon, herring, sardines. So again, well, one of these fish at least a week. And then the 2 other ones can be really anything. It could be grouper, could be tilapia, could be snapper, could be shrimp, could be lobster. It doesn't really matter, but we want fish and seafood to be the main source of animal protein in the diet. Again, coming back to the type of fat that's in there. Those omega-3 fatty acids, those unsaturated fats are so healthy for us. Now, dairy products, they're definitely in a Mediterranean diet, but if you have GI symptoms when eating dairy products, I would say be very, very careful. Don't go over your personal threshold for dairy products. Me, myself, I can't have more than 2 or 3 bites of something with dairy in it before I have GI symptoms. So again, if you're kind of on that lower spectrum of tolerance for dairy products, whether that is milk or yogurt or cheeses or creams, whatever it is, again, just be very careful. Don't push yourself. If you can't do any dairy products, that's okay. There's non-dairy alternatives if you need something in the place of milk. They even make vegan cheeses and vegan yogurts now. So again, something to look into. Eggs, again, in a Mediterranean diet, but we don't emphasize a ton of eggs. If you're an egg eater, again, there's nothing that says you have to eat eggs. If you're an egg eater, I recommend maybe 6 to 8 eggs per week. If you're eating more than a dozen eggs per week, I really wonder, are you getting all the fruit? Are you getting all the veggies? Are you getting all the fish in the diet? Or are you just filling up eggs every morning and then not really getting everything else you need that we know is super duper beneficial for neurological and immunological health? Poultry. So this is your chicken. This is your turkey. These are great sources of protein. This is what you eat when you're not eating fish and seafood. This fills the gap, okay? Again, great source of protein, not really so much in the way of those omega-3 fatty acids, that EPA and DHA, so something to fill the gaps here. And then wine. If you drink alcohol, we recommend maybe 1 serving of alcohol a night with a meal with someone. There's no nutritive effect of alcohol. You're not going to get any significant amount of antioxidants from the red wine that you're drinking, but there's something that's just as, or rather more powerful, and that's the stress reduction effect of alcohol. So again, as long as we're not overdoing it, we get to enjoy our meal more intimately. We get to enjoy the company that we're with more intimately. We get to reduce our stress, and that can have a significant impact on our health and quality of life. If you don't drink, that's great. There's actually some very interesting recommendations coming out from some of the big medical associations around the world talking about how maybe we don't want to drink alcohol at all because of some of the risks that are associated with it. But until there's agreement across the board, I'll kind of just stick with my usual recommendation. Last thing I want to talk about here is, what do we want to limit? And there's really not that much we need to limit. We don't want a lot of refined sugars, right? I think everybody knows that. We shouldn't be living off of cakes and candies and ice cream and ho-hos every day, but we can still enjoy them. Maybe a couple times a week. Look forward to it. Special occasions. It's your birthday. It's somebody's party. Every once in a while, having a piece of cake, a cookie, a bowl of ice cream, perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt you in any way, shape, or form. Same thing with red meats and processed meats. If it's occasionally in the diet, that's perfectly fine. But we're not reaping a huge nutritive benefit from having a lot of red meat, which is beef and pork, in the diet. So if we're doing a lot of deli meats or things like that, that is, again, something that we might want to limit, maybe want to substitute out for something a little bit more healthy. So again, concentrate on getting the fish and seafood and the poultry. And then every once in a while, when you have a craving or if it's a special occasion, you want to treat yourself and you like it, have some red meat. That's fine. So again, everything that I just kind of talked about is here on the screen, all the serving sizes there. If you want to take a picture of that, that's perfectly fine. One of the things that's on here that I didn't mention was sofrito. So sofrito is a base that's really made out of tomato, onion, and garlic. It's kind of the start of a fairly standard spaghetti sauce, but in the Mediterranean regions, Italy, south of France, south of Spain, the Middle East, Northern Africa, maybe not so much Northern Africa, but this is a base for a lot of different foods or meals. You can put veggies in here, you can put seafood in here, and it's a great way to really kind of step up the flavor of foods that you might not really be interested in eating anyway. So again, making things taste good, that's always something I'm interested in as a dietitian and just as a regular human who likes to taste things. That's always something that I'm interested in doing. So try out that. Try out a base of sofrito. There's plenty of recipes online, but again, very, very simple. Tomato, onion, garlic, maybe some herbs in there, maybe some thyme. It's going to taste great. And so with that, I'd love to open up the floor. Feel free to ask me any questions about diet, nutrition, supplements. Happy to take your questions at this time. Thank you so much.
Questions here in the audience?
So I think the issue of diet can be controversial. And one of the questions, one of the diets that's been very popular at times is the high protein diet. And what's interesting to me is that if you actually look at data and you look at people who've been on the Mediterranean diet, other kinds of diets, and the high protein diets, and especially these are people I think who are looking for weight loss. Mm-hmm. It turns out that the people who are on the high protein diet tend to lose more weight. There's no question about that. They get into acidosis or whatever because of that. A lot of butyrate in the system. But it also turns out that after a given amount of time on a diet, they tend to maintain weight loss better than people who are on other kinds of diets. And what's most interesting, which I think befuddles all of us who like to think we're looking at science, is that their chemistries actually look better than other people's. And so the question is, what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially around weight loss, there's some obvious indicators that eating a high protein diet is going to cause some very rapid weight loss. You're kind of doing a modified ketogenic diet at that point. So you're going to kind of waste all of the glycogen in your body. And so you're going to lose a lot of water weight with that too. Protein is also very filling. And so depending on how it is carried forward, you can have a fairly substantial drop in weight and maintain blood lipid levels, depending on where the protein is coming from. One of the things that I hear about a lot is people doing a dirty ketogenic diet. And it's not really a ketogenic diet. It's a very high protein diet, mainly from red meat, sausage, bacon, avocado. If you were to do this quote unquote Mediterranean diet, ketogenic diet, that would not result in super positive lab values, lipid panels and things like that. What's recently also come out is a lot of literature on the Mediterranean diet and how it can help with weight loss. The fiber in the diet is very filling. the foods emphasized in a Mediterranean diet are not very high calorie, maybe save for nuts though. And so I think it all comes down to approach. There's also a lot more literature. This was a big deal maybe 15 or 20 years ago from my understanding, but the circadian aspect of diet as well. We kind of have this diet that is flipped on top of our heads in modern American society, where we skip breakfast, we might have lunch, and then we have this enormous dinner. And that is in complete opposite of what the body wants to do. And so even outside of what you're eating, timing is also very important. So I think there's, to your point, there's a lot going on, but again, with lipid values in mind, panels in mind, weight loss in mind, and the obesity epidemic in America, I am still someone to recommend a Mediterranean diet, again, because also very easy to follow. One of the things with these very high protein or even a textbook ketogenic diet, very hard to follow for long periods of time. So again, liberalizing the diet, getting a lot of different foods available to the patients, I think has a great benefit over just kind of emphasizing one thing way, way, way too hard.
I understand we all have quite a different microbiome. Mine's different than yours. But do we all have the good microbes, and it's a matter of feeding those? We don't need to be seeded with the good microbes?
Generally, yes. Yes, we all have them. There is a possibility that you might not have a very small community of very niche bacteria. So when you look at a probiotic supplement, you'll see the big communities of bacteria: Lactobacillus acidophilus, Bifidobacterium. These are big families of bacteria that make up the majority of the gut microbiome in humans. So generally speaking, yes, you have the bugs you need, but there is a possibility that you might not have a specific niche of bacteria that could be helpful in producing, say, butyrate for our bodies, or maybe a different chemical compound that's beneficial for another community of bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract. That's not really something we can look at right now. We can't send our stools into a lab and they'll tell us what we're missing. But really it comes back to the diet. The diet is the master regulator of the gut microbiome. So if your diet is diverse, your gut microbiome is going to be diverse. That's the best we can do.
What about these like Nutrisystems and package that are sent to you for weight loss? Do they live up to the kind of nutrition you're talking about at all, or?
They're a lot better than they used to be. I was actually very often, I talk about how the freezer section of the grocery store looks way better than it did 10 or 20 years ago. I remember walking through the freezer section as a kid, and my mom would pick out, these cardboard, TV dinners, that tasted, not great. There is a lot of great nutrition that can come from the freezer section, the Nutrisystem stuff, the Blue Aprons, those different meal services. So I think nowadays there's a big push by these companies to provide some real nutrition there, some real good nutrition. So generally speaking, yes, they're perfectly fine. Again, as long as you're choosing the choices that gives you the most variety, and of course, emphasizing the things that we talked about today.
Okay, we still have a couple more questions, but let's take two from chat.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have some questions here from Keith Berg. What do you think about adding soluble fiber supplements like Metamucil for helping with periodic constipation and bowel movements? It's a great question. It's definitely something that I encourage my patients to try. It's not always something that is super duper helpful. It could be a concentration issue. So maybe getting enough of that Metamucil in without, making yourself sick, because again, that's not especially fun to take. Kind of turns into a jelly if you let it sit too long. And so again, I encourage people to try it. It could be very helpful, but oftentimes I still recommend fruit over Metamucil because it's so much easier to consume. You can make a smoothie with 2 cups of frozen berries in it, and that's going to be so much easier to consume rather than trying to, choke down a big old glass of Metamucil. So again, perfectly fine to try, but again, a little easier to do the fruit. We have another comment here. If you are a small person, a little over 100 pounds, you cannot eat as much as recommended. Yeah, so that's a good point. Everybody's unique. Right, exactly. You don't need as much. You don't need to eat all of that food, but we do want to, again, emphasize those foods in the same way. Again, those are general recommendations. So, maybe eating all of that fish or eating all of that fruit every single day could be a little difficult. But again, we want to create the diet, build the diet around those highly emphasized foods so that we're getting as much as we can.
One more comment there.
Yes. What are your thoughts on intermittent fasting if it was used with a Mediterranean diet? Intermittent fasting is undoubtedly a great way to lose weight. There are other things that intermittent fasting is supposedly good for, but needs to be researched a lot more, like healthy aging or longevity, I should say. That has been shown in animal models, and something that the professors in my department, the Food Science and Human Nutrition Department, have taught me is that you only study an animal if you want to know about an animal. And so until intermittent fasting studies show us in humans that it is good for longevity, I will forego recommending it for longevity. But yes, intermittent fasting for certain people can be very, very effective for weight loss. So I hope that answered that question there.
Question about people trying to follow Mediterranean diet, but at the connection between trying to eat organic, trying to eat a variety, trying to eat fresh, trying to eat local. We don't get mackerel here, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the most important in that? And are non-fresh foods really good for you?
It's a great question. I think a lot of people twist themselves into knots trying to get organic foods. And I kind of understand it, right? I mean, we want to limit our exposure to, heavy metals, pesticides, agrochemicals as much as possible. So I respect it, but I think sometimes it's incredibly difficult to do. And so, for instance, with veggies and fruit, fish and seafood, what I recommend is trying to go for the wild caught or organic option as often as you can. If you can't find, the fish that you want to eat tonight for dinner that's wild caught, it's okay to do canned or frozen or if it's not fresh, that's okay. But you want to do wild caught fish and seafood as often as you can, but don't sweat it if you can't find it occasionally. Fresh food versus frozen versus canned, talking about veggies here, I suppose, maybe fruit as well. Again, something that's unnecessary to really worry too much about. What we really want is to be getting that food generally. And so it's much better for you to get those 3 cups of fruit than it is to only get 1 cup, but it's organic and local. So again, just try to do the best you can. Don't worry too much about, buying local and organic and all of that stuff all at once.
About every 15 minutes on TV, I hear somebody giving a testimonial for encapsulated fruits and vegetables. With the Mediterranean diet, is there any need for any of those fruits and vegetables in those little pills?
I love the way you phrased that, by the way. No, there is not. That is the best way that I like to describe those products, whether they're in a capsule or a powder, is a very, very overly expensive multivitamin. So the way they make these is basically they have the fruit or the veggies, they dehydrate them, they pulverize them into a powder, and maybe they encapsulate them, or maybe they just put them into a jug and then they sell you the jug. Much easier to just eat the food, right? Much easier to just eat the food. You're not paying a premium for, again, whatever they did to that product. And oftentimes, that process of making it into a powder destroys a lot of the vitamins and minerals. And so they have to add them back anyway through different means. And so again, in my mind, completely unnecessary, a huge waste of money. Just spend that money on food. That's what I would recommend.
I was wondering about eggs. You made the
proposition that you could take eggs a week.
Yes.
And it used to be very controversial to eat eggs every day. So what is the change in that recommendation?
Still a lot of controversy. That's why I have a fairly moderate recommendation. Again, 6 to 8 eggs per week. That's not something that's likely going to blow up someone's lipid panel very much. But right now, the research has a lot to do with your genetics. You might be somebody who can eat, 2 dozen eggs a week and not see any change in your lipid panel. Me, if I try to eat 2 dozen eggs a week, I don't know, maybe my cholesterol would skyrocket. And so again, it's something that we want to monitor in our patients. You want to monitor it for yourself as well. But again, as long as you're not, again, living off of eggs and only eggs, I don't see much issue there. An egg can be a perfectly fine ingredient in a food, or it can be a great breakfast, again, as long as we're switching up and getting all the other good stuff.
There is a comment online. Barb, unmute.
Go ahead and unmute.
Barbara Rothstein, unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, somebody else just told me to do the same thing. I'm doing some reading for a friend. I'm a biologist, so I'm trying to help her out. And she has a gut problem, and she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Do you know any other research I haven't been able to find, or is there anybody doing anything, or is anybody in your group treat people like that I could send her over to you?
Some patients have come across the clinic that have that syndrome. I'm not very well versed in it, and I'd be happy to look on PubMed to find some research there. But off the top of my head, unfortunately, I don't know. I can't speak to that right here at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
I have a little problem with your recommendation for high fruit.
Sure.
Fruit is just full of fructose, which is the most sweet sugar there is.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a problem in this country of obesity and diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
Comment.
My comment is the fruit, or the sugar that is in fruit is very different than extracting fructose from the fruit. It's trapped in the food matrix of the fruit, including the fiber. And so I'll give you another example. There's been a lot of research on beans and peas and lentils, very high in carbohydrates, but also very high in fiber. When they gave these foods to diabetics, so again, already a high level of circulating blood glucose, their blood glucose levels actually dropped when they increased their consumption of these very high carbohydrate foods.
Why wouldn't it be absorbed later? He's saying it's tied up with fiber, but it's
Correct.
going to be broken down.
Not all fiber is broken down. Not all fiber is broken down. Otherwise, we wouldn't have much of the bowel movements, right? So some fiber is used for the bacterial fermentation processes. A lot of it, again, is still what makes up the stool bulk, the bulk of the stool.
But isn't that soluble fiber that's in the fruit?
Mostly soluble, yes. But no food only contains soluble or insoluble fiber. It's always a mix. We speak a little bit too often in absolutes. And so again, generally fruit has more soluble fiber, and generally veggies have more insoluble fiber, but all fruits or all foods have both. And so again, bringing it back to fruit, the fiber traps a lot of that sugar in the food matrix. And so some of it doesn't get absorbed, and the stuff that does isn't absorbed quickly. It's absorbed through its travel through the small intestines. So again, what you see a lot of times is that blood sugar levels actually improve when you increase dietary intake of foods that have high fiber outside of any carbohydrate or simple sugar that's in those foods.
I think I'll ask the last question. I want to comment on your comment on drinking wine or glass of alcohol.
Sure.
It's supposed to be now resveratrol in red wine was supposed to be the good stuff. Now they say it doesn't matter.
Correct.
So does that mean white wine is as good as red wine every day? Because I don't like red wine.
Yeah, right,
Drink
exactly.
wine.
You know,
So
I
white wine is
hesitate.
just-
Yeah, I always hesitate to bring it up, but I was interested when the World Health Organization came out with that new recommendation. So I liked, again, the way that you phrased that question: is white wine as good as red wine? Yeah, I suppose so when you phrase it like that. But again, there's not a nutritive effect of wine. Again, you'd have to. I think the last stat or data on it was you'd have to drink something like 120 bottles of red wine to get any clinically significant amount of resveratrol
Resveratrol, right.
in the
So
blood.
what you're saying is that it's the stress-reducing effect
Right.
of wine that's beneficial.
Right,
So white
exactly.
wine has to be as good. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Should we stop?